Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon, Linda.
I'm Linda Dixon from the Lexington Veterans Association, and I'm happy to welcome you to a presentation on the world's deadliest weapon, the submarine, from pigboat to planet killer. We also welcome our fellow veterans who are viewing this program from the Edith Norris Rogers Veterans Memorial Hospital in Bedford, Massachusetts. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Max Mulholland. Max Mulholland, a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, served 10 years as a surface warfare officer in the U.S. Navy. He taught naval tactics and strategy for 3 years at the German Naval College. After military service, he earned an MBA from Harvard Business School, and for the past 25 years, Max has worked in general management, strategic planning, sales and marketing, business development, and operations, both in industry and the public sector. He has published 2 papers on naval and diplomatic history. We're delighted to have him back. Max has spoken to us twice in the past, and we're really so happy to have him come back and talk to us again. Please welcome Max Mulholland.
So we're going to start with an introduction to what the terminology of pigboat and planet killer, what it means and its context, but Linda did a phenomenal job on that already, so I don't need to explain that. As you can think about, in the early 20th century, officers in their starched whites on their bridges looked down upon submariners because these officers and enlistment basically were indistinguishable. They worked in a dirty, cramped environment, and after more than a day or two at sea, when they came back to the surface and left their boats, they were covered with a fine sheen of oil over their entire bodies, and therefore they really didn't need to wear any kind of rank insignia because they're basically covered with again, an oily surface. So that's what they called pigboats, because again, they were looked down upon. And the surface Navy, with their big battleships and their formations and so forth, it was seen as a less than desirable profession. Although if you think about it, Admiral Nimitz, who was the commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, actually started his career first as a surface warfare officer and then going into the submarine force, where he was very successful. Now, this is a 2-hour presentation that I'm going to condense down into 1 hour. Linda said there's about an hour to do this. I'm going to go at a relatively brisk pace. I'm going to touch on the highlights of the slides, not read everything for you. But if you do have any, so we're going to talk about the purpose and employment of submarines in general, the design, layout, classification, the shipboard weapon systems and sensors that they use, a little bit of operations, and also terminology. We're not going to talk about tactics. That's for another future presentation. So if you've been to my 2 earlier presentations on the Battle of the Atlantic, Black May, if you've been to my one on the development of the U.S. Navy attack submarine, we're going to talk in the next lecture at some future point, Linda, on submarine tactics, submarine and anti-submarine warfare tactics. So we're going to talk about submarines. These are large, crewed, autonomous vessels. We're not going to talk about UUVs, the unmanned underwater vehicles, or AUVs, autonomous underwater vehicles, which are basically for research purposes and so forth. We're talking about basically a military vessel, which can submerge and which is used obviously for military purposes. So midget submarines, remote operated systems, that's not part of this discussion. The submarine was the first stealth weapon ever developed. The reason was that obviously that it could submerge where it could not be seen, and therefore it could attack out secretly or out in a surprise concept to its targets. Now, submarines today, and have been since the beginning, are made up of some of the most highly motivated, technically adept and intelligent people, engineers and technicians anywhere on the planet. As Linda mentioned, yes, slow down. One submarine, one ballistic missile submarine carries more firepower than basically unleashed, not only in all of World War II, but as she mentioned, since the history of mankind. Anybody who's been on board a submarine, you know, it's an incredibly cramped space. So they have to basically put as much as they can into as small a hull as possible. And therefore submarines are very, very compact and also just stuffed to the gills with all kinds of systems. There's electronics, there's piping systems, there's communications, there's weapons, there's fluids, there's heat, and so forth. So if you've been on a submarine, you can see these are some pretty typical scenes on board. The submarines first were developed in the 1890s. They were seen as the weapon of the weaker powers. Basically, any country that could not afford a battle fleet went into submarines. So the Germans went into submarines. The French Navy was also one of the early adopters of submarines. But for the Royal Navy, to a bit degree, the US Navy as well, these looked down upon and seen as a sea denial weapon that second-rate navies use, not first-rate navies, which again, as you can see in the upper right-hand picture, really were invested into large battle fleets. Now, World War I was the first realization worldwide that submarine was really not a second-rate weapon, but could impact the development or the role of surface warfare. So in September 1914, just 1 month, less than a month actually, after the World War I broke out in Europe, a single small German submarine, the U-9, sank 3 large Royal Navy armored cruisers in the North Sea off the Dutch coast, with the loss of thousands of lives. This was a wake-up call to navies that maybe these submarines aren't simply a defensive weapon, maybe they can be used in an offensive capacity as well. And then obviously, as we know, in 1915, less than a year later, the Lusitania was sunk off the Irish coastline by a German submarine, which was one of the major causes for bringing the US into World War I. Is there a way to get this bar out of the way? Thank you. Now, World War II was in many ways a rerun of World War I, at least in the Atlantic. The Battle of the Atlantic in World War II was the longest, largest, most complex naval battle in history. It began on the first day of World War II, on September 1st, 1939, when the first combat took place by submarines. And then it lasted all the way to the last day of the war in the Pacific in August 1945, when US submarines finally were told to stand down and stop attacking Japanese vessels. Thank you. It was a brutal concept, brutal war at the Atlantic. Churchill famously reported the only thing that ever really frightened him in the course of the war was the U-boat peril, not bombing of London, not the threat of invasion, but the U-boat force for cutting England off from the rest of the world. Now in the Pacific, frozen.
I don't know why I sat so far.
You should sit over here.
I think I will. I don't know what is going
I don't
on.
know.
All right, try again.
Okay. Yes, okay. That's the next slide.
Okay.
Thank you. Sorry, a little technical issues. So in the Pacific, the US Navy basically did to Japan what Germany tried to do to Great Britain. While Germany failed, in the Pacific, the US Navy actually succeeded, cutting Japan off from its sources of raw materials and sinking a huge percentage of its Navy using the submarine. Now, submarine force was small, 1.6% of all the naval personnel, but also had the highest loss rate of any force in the US military. 22% of all submariners who went to sea ended up perishing. Over 50 submarines were lost in combat. So it was a very dangerous business, but at the same time, very successful. Over half the majority of the Japanese merchant marine was sent to the bottom, as well as nearly a third of the entire Japanese Navy surface ships. So the World War experience of both World War I and World War II really showed that submarines were a decisive weapon. They were no longer a secondary support system, but actually were something that could be used in an offensive capacity. Now, and again, as in the beginning, they were looked upon as somehow deceitful. These are dishonorable weapons, underhand, unfair, and undamned, un-English, as one British vice admiral said prior to World War I. But again, the experience of the war showed that these suddenly become a strategic weapon that could be used in an incredible capacity to wage war on one's enemy. Now, the thing is that submarines up until World War II and after for about a decade or two or more operated primarily on the surface, which meant that they were basically 95% of the time they were running around on surface or running on their diesel engines, we'll talk about in a moment. They only would submerge if there was a threat of a counterattack to them. So if you see all the World War II movies and the submarines are always underwater attacking their enemy, the fact is that's not how the war was fought. It didn't happen during daytime underwater. The Germans very quickly came to realize in 1941, if you saw my presentation on Black May, that the way to sink enemy ships was on the surface when you could operate on diesel engines at high speeds, and to do it at night when you couldn't be seen. Radar was basically a rudimentary technology at this point, and a small submarine surface with just a conning tower above the water was very hard to see. The US Navy adopted the same tactics as the Japanese, not operating at the day underwater, but on the surface at night when you could keep up with, to get an advanced position, and then basically the enemy ship would come into your sights, you'd fire a torpedo and you'd sink it. which makes those submarines vulnerable to counterattack if they're ever detected. And so during during World War II, the Allies, with air superiority in European theater, absolutely destroyed the German submarine force through air attack primarily, not by surface ships. Now in the 1950s, the advent of nuclear technology meant that in contrast to the older submarines are now faster underwater than they were on the surface. They're also independent of air, so they operate indefinitely underwater. They make their own oxygen, they make their own fresh water. The only thing that limits the capacity of a nuclear submarine underwater is basically how much food you can bring on board. They have enough energy on board the reactors. Basically, it's a one and done reactor core. I mean, it's a 30-year lifetime. It means you can go around the world over and over and over and over and over until the crew starve to death. So some nuclear submarines are basically a quantum leap in capabilities. Now, the fact was that the submarine hulls also needed to reflect that. So on the left-hand side, you see a typical World War II fleet boat, which in many ways it was a hybrid between a surface ship and a ship that could submerge. So it had basically above the water, where it operated most of the time, but looks like a regular boat hull. While the nuclear submarine on the right-hand side has a teardrop hull, which is basically makes it very hydrodynamically efficient, makes it incredibly fast, because again, its speed was underwater, where it spent the vast majority of its time. Well, the submarine on the left, a conventional submarine, operated on the surface most of the time. Now, the ideal hull form for a underwater body is body of continuous revolution. That's a scientific or engineering concept. Basically, this means a constantly tapered shape like a balloon, or not one of these Chinese spy balloons, but one of these advertising balloons. And this ideal shape for withstanding great pressures. But again, you can't make a complete blimp-like design, although again, there have been submarines that have been similar to that. Now, the perfect hydrodynamic shape of this body of continuous revolution includes the tuna, bonito, bull shark, and mako shark. Now, what are unique about these four types of fishes? They're high-speed fishes, high-speed game fishes that attack. They eat other fishes. Right? These are carnivores of the ocean, and they're very fast also. And so, in many ways, today's submarine hulls reflect, in some ways, a copying of a hull design that was developed through evolution in nature. Now, the Russian submarines for many years continued to follow this continuous taper rule whenever possible, while US and Western submarine designers generally did not. So basically, we had a cylinder with a curved bow and a curved stern, or shaped curved bow and stern, but with cylinders at the center. The Russians, for the most part, you saw my presentation on US Navy tech submarine, you can see some pictures of the submarines, the Russian submarines that were similar to that. Now, most modern submarines have what's called a single hull, a single pressure hull, basically which stands sea pressure. And then all of the important systems on board, or many of them, are found inside this high strength, high tensile steel body. It's used for holding pressure, okay, making sure that the submarine does not crush at the depths that it's operating in. It also contains, again, most of the critical systems, although outboard, there's a fairing, it's a casing which floods, and you can find other systems, sensors, and communications, electronics, and so forth outside the submarine. But for the most part, single hull was the design. Russian submarines, as mentioned, in some cases had double hulls. These made them much bigger, but at the same time gave them some protection against battle damage. If the outer hull took the impact of a torpedo, if it was a lightweight torpedo dropped by a helicopter, for example, it wouldn't result in the loss of the entire submarine. But the US concept, Western concept, has been for a single pressure hull. Now, a lot of submarines today are covered with sound dampening. This is part of tiles called anechoic tiles. This is part of their stealth concept. They basically not only muffle sound from the submarine from radiating into the outer ocean, but also are sonar absorbent. So think about a lot of the stealth aircraft we have today, which are radar absorbent technologies that they have. Some of the really exotic materials that we coat our aircraft with. Well, submarines also have a coating, but one of the difficulties, as you can see, the technique to have these tiles adhering to a steel hull is still problematic. And you can see while they are covered with anechoic tiles, at high speed when maneuvering, you intend to shed them occasionally. So. Now, the perfect sphere for withstanding high pressure is is a sphere. This means stresses all around it are exactly equal, provides the greatest resistance to crushing of any single design. So on the bottom hand, you can see the early bathyspheres, bathscapes that were used were diving bells, is the original technology, were spheres with a hull or entrance where a person could climb in and out, and then a small glass window where they could see what's going on outside. Now, if you look at the two deepest diving submarines in the West, First is the Alvin. That's a Woods Hole submersible. You're probably familiar with. It always seems to be in the news. It's been in service for over 50 years, which is amazing for little Alvin. But you can see in the right-hand picture, the cross-section, in the front of Alvin, there is this titanium bathysphere, and that's where the two crew members sit in. So the rest of the Alvin is just for support of the bathysphere. And then the Trieste, which was the first submarine to go to the Challenger Deep at more than 35,000 feet deep. Also, while it was a very big submersible, you can see all that was really important is that small, again, titanium bathysphere at the bottom, hanging from the bottom. The rest of it was all support systems. The only attempt ever to make a purely spherical combat vessel was the Empire's Death Star. We know that it was not successful. It had its own weak points along the way. So since you can't make a spherical combat vessel that would be useful in any way, the next best shape, as mentioned, is a cylinder. This is like basically in cross section, it is a circular design, but it's long as opposed to simply round all around. Now, it's not an accident that all pressure containers today and vacuum chambers as well are shaped like cylinders. So if you think about, again, they got some compressed gas, you've got a CO2 container, you've got a natural gas container, all cylinders. And so the green item down below is in many ways a cross section of what a submarine would look like. And they call it the people tank, which is basically that single hull that allows the pressure of the sea outside to be kept out. So no matter what the submarine looks like on the outside, inside the submarine, there is again this cylinder-shaped pressure hull. Those are shown in yellow. So even those are three radically different submarines, not so radically. They're basically the same layout. They have a different size pressure hull inside, and that's basically where the people tank is located. Now, the submarine hulls are made of extremely strong, thick, high tensile steel. They're obviously a very complex structure. They're made with incredible amounts of quality control to ensure that there are no defects. Again, a single defect or weak point in the hull can result in the submarine collapsing or crushing if it gives way. And so they're very strong ribs. They're extremely lengthy and strong. They have a great margin of error as well in terms of pressure, so that even though they have a particular target test depth, in reality submarines can go below their design test depth to their crush depth, although you wouldn't want to try that too often. Now, should a submarine experience any kind of catastrophic event, there are several ways of rescuing the crew. The first one in the upper left is a free escape. So basically it means the submarine is less than 80 feet deep. Basically it means you flood a container and the crew can swim to the surface by holding their breath. Okay, and they're trained how to do that at submarine school. However, if it's below 80 feet to 200 feet, there's a free ascent, which basically means they have to wear a pressure suit that allows them to escape. If you just go outside 200 feet without preparation, it'd be very dangerous to do so. And then below 200 feet, it requires a specific rescue vessel. This is where I took out the slides on the squalus. It's not going. It's not going.
On the screen again.
Okay. Thank you. So here's some pictures. Free escape basically means you're wearing basically scuba gear and a life vest and escaping through an opening in the hull. The free ascent basically, again, is a different one. Now you're wearing a special pressurized escape suit. And then below that's the DSRV, or the Deep Submerged Rescue Vehicle. And for those of you who've seen the movie Hunt for Red October, remember the Dallas was carrying the DSRV that mated with the hull of the Red October, allowed the crew to transition from one submarine to another. So the DSRV has been designed specifically, I don't believe they're in service anymore though, to be air capable, so they can be carried inside a C5 Galaxy, flown to the nearest port and mounted onto a submarine, which can then go to where the submarine is in distress. They have specific navigation systems and regular hardware as well to be able to mate with basically any submarine on the planet, including Russian submarines. So NATO submarines, US submarines, even Russian submarines. There's been this agreement system that allows us to use our systems in the event that they have a casualty and they require our help. Now, building a submarine is something also that's very complex to do. The principle is 100 years old. It's called top loading. Basically means you make the hull, they told that large, strong pressure hull, and then you stuff it with piping, wiring, equipment, power systems, and everything else like that. In many ways, it's called like building a ship within a bottle, though. Really hard to do, and it's relatively lengthy to do as well successfully. So one of the new concepts, although again, what was old is new, is to build submarines in modules. So now instead of having one hull that you stuff everything into, you build them in particular subsections, and then you weld them together. The first of the Virginia-class submarines had 7 different hull sections originally, and through constant design and continuous improvement, they've gone down to 3 sections now. So now there's 3 systems. They basically weld together. They build them in separate locations. They move them around on barges up and down the East Coast. And so they build them not only in. Does that mean?
I don't know why it keeps popping up. I'm sorry.
That's right. They not only build them in Groton, Connecticut, but also at Newport News down in Virginia, and then they move them around. But this is something that was actually introduced by the Germans in World War II, as their ports were being bombed day and night by the RAF and the US Air Force. They realized that having a submarine on the ways for weeks on end was just too problematic. It gave the Allies the opportunity to destroy or partially damage the submarine while it was being built. So they would build them in modules in locations upriver from major German ports, which then be floated downstream, and similar to what we're doing today, welded together and send the submarine out to sea. Now, the raised conning tower on a submarine is known as a sail. The sail is basically where the bridge is located, where the officer of the deck will then guide the ship and give his orders when the submarine is on the surface. Now, what originally started as we now have a big conning tower. In the early days, it was just basically a raised area just to prevent water from flooding down the hatch when the submarine crewmen escaped from, or not escaped from, but exited the submarine from. But over the years, that small little raised area has grown into much larger, much more purposeful. Different navies, as you can see, have taken different approaches to sail design. Some actually have sail planes mounted on the sail. Some of them have them on the hull, on the bow. But at the same time, when you have seen World War II movies, they have basically one periscope going up, looking around, seeing if there's anybody around. Submarines today, the sail is jam-packed with not only periscopes of multiple different types and sizes and purposes, but also all kinds of electronic sensors and systems as well. So submarines are great for use in surveillance of enemy harbors, of enemy coastlines as well. They do signals intelligence. They gather all kinds of radio communications as well. So they permit the submarine to search, periscope, scan, identify, track, and engage. They're not only optical, so they use regular, white light, but also use infrared, so they can see at night, and they also use radar. Now, again, if you use the first optical infrared are passive means of collecting. If you can use a radar from a submarine, you're obviously giving your position away. If the target can detect the submarine's radar that it's utilizing. Now, on the left-hand side shows the original concept. They had a prismatic system of lenses and hydraulics that would move the periscope up and down. And you can see the officer on the bottom left looking through the periscope. And the funny thing is only that one officer, that one person can look through the periscope at any one time. Today we have what's called photonic masts. It's a digital camera, again, optical or infrared or other types used. And rather than being through one person, it displays onto a flat screen. So on the right-hand side is a lieutenant. He's using a joystick controller, basically a lot like an Xbox controller, to navigate around on a screen. Not only can he see what's going on, the captain and his cabins can see what he's watching at. The combat information and watch officer can see what he's looking at. So basically, multiple people can see what's occurring simultaneously. The attack periscope is the traditional one you most see in movies, like Run Silent, Run Deep. It's small. It's intended to be the smallest possible cross section, and so that it's hardest to see when you're targeting your target or attacking your target. But today's antennas, again, the one on the right-hand side is actually from the 1960s. And you can see, so from World War II, we had basically 1 or 2 periscopes. This is 1960s, that's long ago. There were a whole bunch of systems that could be raised and lowered from the submarine sail to see and basically understand the environment around it. Now, how does a submarine get around? Well, flying a submarine is like flying an airplane. It's a 3-dimensional environment. And so they have planes, both on the foreplanes on the sail or at the bow. They have tailplanes as well, just like an airplane does. And they bank, they climb, they dive, just like airplanes do. When they're doing turns, they do it at an angle. And the whole point is that you can adjust your depth and your heading very quickly utilizing your control surfaces. So again, to make the submarine dive, the diving officer will command some bow planes and stern planes made to work together until the submarine reaches its desired target depth, at which point it levels out. Here's a picture of a relatively late model submarine. This is not current. This is like one of the older 688 class, Los Angeles class submarines. Shows you the diving officer off the deck. He's there sitting in the chair, and he's got the helmsman in front of him who are going to be utilizing the planes. Control centers have changed greatly over time. So in the 1920s, it was relatively rudimentary, but look at the bottom right, that looks like the deck of the space shuttle. And that's basically really close to what it looks like. Incredibly complex. And that's why the submarine force basically gets first cut on all enlisted sailors. Those who have the highest intelligence, pass the highest educational scores on their tests and so forth, go to the submarine force, because it takes an incredible amount of understanding of very complex systems to become a submariner. Now, submarine control service can take a variety of different shapes. There's a couple of pictures of them on different types of submarines. And they also work not only the planes, but also ballast tanks. So as you see, you've heard runs out and run deep on, blow tanks, basically, which is to put high pressure air into a ballast tank to expel the water, which causes the submarine to rise to the surface. But they have not only ballast tanks, they've got trim tanks, they've got feed water tanks, they've got freshwater tanks, they've got sewage tanks. There are a lot of tanks on board a submarine. Here's just a quick depiction of an older class World War II style submarine with a bunch of its tanks. But the picture here on the left-hand side is actually the tank control station, which also, if you think about it, looks like the flight deck of a 747 in terms of the complexity. And so therefore, it's not like the old days. We just push water out of a tank or allow water to enter a tank. Now it requires a very complex series of steps using computers to understand trim and balance and list and so forth. The system on the right is just a schematic of the high pressure air system. This is one of over a dozen types of systems that are used in keeping these tanks at the level that they need to be. So simply, as you can see, you open up the tank, allow water to flood into the open of the ventilator on top. The water flows in until the depth is reached, until neutral buoyancy is achieved, or slightly negative buoyancy, and then to surface again, basically expel the water using high pressure air. Simple concept. Here's a picture of a submarine that's preparing to dive. You say, well, aren't they blowing their tanks? The answer is no, actually they're flooding their tanks. But you see that spray is the water rushing up from beneath into the tank and expelling the air from it. So here's some pictures of some extreme concepts of surfacing under emergencies. That's blowing all the tanks using high pressure air, putting the engines on maximum belt, putting the stern planes and bow planes in appropriate condition, then charging to the surface. This is done again, usually during emergencies or when you're making a movie such as Hunt for Red October, because it has really cool special effects. It's kind of that wow factor to it. When it comes to propulsion, the very first submarines were hand powered. So the submarine on the upper left is called the Turtle. It was used in the Revolutionary War. It was actually the first combat mission of any submarine to attack British Royal Navy ships in New York Harbor. Unfortunately, it was not successful. The reason was that the British ships that were in New York Harbor had recently recoppered their hulls, and therefore the drill bit, as you can see, that it was supposed to drill through and detach an explosive device, weren't able to get any kind of purchase on the submarine hulls. On the right-hand side in the upper corner is the Hunley, which actually carried out the very first successful submarine attack, sinking the USS Housatonic off of South Carolina Charleston Harbor. Of course, it sank itself, killed all of its crew, so it was kind of a one-way mission, suicide mission, but it was also the very first successful attack. Now, these days, power is not people turning a screw or a winch or so forth. It's diesel electric, it's nuclear, or it's AIP, air independent propulsion. That's kind of the most recent concept that's gaining a lot of, making a lot of headways into nuclear, and using fuel cells and Stirling engines. Talk about those shortly. Now, the basic concept of the powered submarine was designed by an American called John Holland. He founded an electric boat company, now General Dynamics Electric Boat in New London. And the Holland boat, when he built it, was the sensation, the very first modern submarine that included batteries, command control center, included diesel engines, it included a periscope. It was really the first altogether thought through a full-scale submarine. That before those, it were trials, early prototypes. But John Holland put this together. It ended up being the USS Holland, which then was recommissioned as the USS S1 in 1901. But the layout is basically very similar. The engine in the back, torpedoes in the front, and the periscopes are through a sail in the center. Even today, the concept that John Holland did over 120 years ago are still in use. Now, diesel electric submarines of different navies look relatively similar, even though they're different in many ways. As I said, the submarine is in many ways recognizable immediately as a submarine. Now, 5 of the 6 are diesel electric, 1 is nuclear. Anybody know which one the nuclear is? So Rubis on the bottom right. It's the smallest nuclear submarine in the French Navy submarine. But again, if you didn't know any better, seeing it's passing by out of your hotel room on the surface downriver, you'd say, gosh, there's another diesel electric submarine. No, that's nuclear. It's very small, but it looks very similar. Now, until nuclear marine propulsion took place, most submarines ran on kerosene engines, gasoline engines, or diesel engines for battery charging and to keep their or reporting on the surface. Diesel electric quickly became the predominant form. The reason is kerosene engines put off a lot of smoke. Basically, wherever the submarine went to trail a long white smoke trail, and gasoline, you want to put gasoline inside a small hull with its flammability issues, not the smart thing to do. It's very toxic, it's very highly explosive. And so diesels, it's a stable fuel, it's a very efficient fuel, it can be easily transferred, it can be used and stored without much danger to it. It became the way that submarines were basically used. Now, diesel electric plants are simple, they're reliable, they're high output power. Like I said before, the fuel's safe to store and handle, very fuel efficient. The largest submarines that were built were the German Navy Type 9. If you've been to the Field Museum in Chicago, the German U-505 is a Type 9. It could do 8,200 miles, which is basically from Germany to the east coast of Africa. The Japanese I-class had 10,000 miles, basically means from Japan you could go into the Caribbean. And then there was a US Navy fleet submarine at 11,000 miles, which is basically from the east coast of the United States all the way to Singapore, which is just astonishing in terms of that. So long-range submarines. Now, the engines that are still in use today are some of the most powerful ones in existence. So, large number of rail engines today were actually copies of older submarine engines. So, large diesel electric trains actually run former submarine engines. The reason being, again, they're high-powered, lightweight, turbocharged, multi-piston models. They can put out a heck of a lot of horsepower from a very compact design. And became very quickly, evident really quickly that this is really the optimal solution, again, prior to nuclear propulsion. Well, diesel electric systems are relatively straightforward. You have basically a diesel engine running a generator, turning an electric motor, which turns the propeller, submarine goes through the water. It's also easy to isolate its components, and when you're operating on batteries alone, it's a very silent means of transportation underwater. Now, the early submarines were direct drive, meaning basically the diesel drove the propeller. It was hooked up through a motor generator to recharge the batteries, but basically anytime the diesel generator was operating, the propeller was turning. Again, realized, we can do better than that. And so all submarines today, diesel electric, have a default. The diesel engine operates independently. It runs, it powers a generator. The generator provides electricity, which will charge the battery or drive the electric motor, which now pushes the propeller. So diesel electric engines today, or diesel engines, are some of the most advanced pieces of electric equipment anywhere in the world. Really, some of the most cutting-edge concepts have first found their way to practical application on submarines because of the advantages of doing so. So on the bottom left, you see a World War I electric propulsion. This is an AC synchronous motor, but a very compact one. On the bottom, on the right-hand side, you can see the latest and greatest. This is absolutely the cutting edge. It's made by Siemens in Germany. It's a permanent magnet DC drive propulsion motor. A wonder of the world. This is an incredibly silent, incredibly power-dense piece of machinery. You can see the technician standing next to it. So that's the electric motor that drives a submarine. Now, when the submarine is not on the surface, it needs to use its batteries to sail. Batteries, basically, in the old days, these were lead-acid batteries. Again, hard to deal with. Had to be stored very carefully. Lead-acid batteries and salt water don't mix. They create chlorine gas, which is obviously hazardous or incredibly dangerous to human beings. But they operate basically banks of batteries in the lowest part of the submarine, which is also a ballast port, so it keeps the submarine upright when the rest of things are empty on board in terms of armaments or fuel. But battery care is extremely sensitive matter because, again, batteries can cause hazards to the crew if any kind of battle damage is experienced if a battery cell cracks. Nowadays, you're using, in many cases, lithium-ion batteries. You're using fuel cells, which, again, are very different than the old lead-acid kind of batteries. So there's a solid-state batteries without any liquids on board. But one of the problems, obviously, from using a diesel electric submarine is then periodic requirement to come to the surface to recharge the batteries to get oxygen for the diesel engines. And so, as I mentioned earlier, the exposure to air attack in World War II was the reason that the German U-boat offensive in the North Atlantic failed, primarily because of air attack. The Allies had just air dominance over the Atlantic and over the European mainland as well, and that was what the majority of submarines were sunk. And if you saw my lecture at that point, bug me, you remember that. But one of the breakthroughs late in the war was the invention of the snorkel. Now, the snorkel basically was a Dutch invention. The Germans found it when they occupied the Netherlands in 1940 in a shipyard. Didn't think much about it, kind of put it on the back burner, kept building submarines the old conventional way until again their losses started spiraling out of control, at which point somebody said, maybe that snorkel is not a bad idea to use. So late 1944 through 1945, the last desperate months of the war, German U-boats went to sea with their snorkel, which means they could sail to their combat positions in the Atlantic using their diesel engines while still submerged. Snorkels are still used on all submarines today. Even nuclear submarines have snorkels on board if they need to, so they can ventilate the submarine. But again, major navies today, and there's only a handful of major navies, use nuclear propulsion. This allows, again, as I said, high speed, unlimited range, which was again, and remaining submerged at all times without exposing oneself to the surface where you give your position away, and therefore liable to counterattack. There are 5 long-term users of nuclear submarines: the US, the Russians, the Brits, the French, the Chinese now, and then as of 2012, India now operates a nuclear submarine. This is a submarine that they had bought on the installment program. It's a Russian nuclear submarine. It's not theirs. They're basically loaning it or leasing it. They have to give it back when they're done with it at some point. And then Brazil today is currently developing very aggressively a program to put a nuclear submarine to sea. Now, with no exceptions, I said a few. Well, I shouldn't say that. There were, historically, they used other kinds of reactors or some power plants. But today, the standard basic at sea is the pressurized water reactor. The U.S. Navy used liquid sodium and so forth. The Russians did as well. Liquid metal as a cooling system, hazardous, high power density, incredible speed, but also extremely hard to manage, to maintain, and to operate. And so therefore pressurized water is basically, and this is just a concept of a pressurized water. I'm not going to go through it. You can find that out on your own. Nuclear propulsion obviously has enormous advantages. There's a 25 to 30 year lifespan. Basically, they commission a submarine with a reactor core, and that's it for the rest of the submarine's life, which is very different from Nautilus. When Nautilus, the very first submarine, went to sea, she could operate for 2 years before she had to come back and have her core replaced. Core design has become incredibly sophisticated using supercomputers and so forth to be able to smooth out power usage and neutron dilution and so forth. Not dilution, fuel dilution. And therefore now it's a one and done. They don't need to refuel submarines anymore. Again, high speed, you can operate also in areas that early submarines could not, like under the Arctic ice pack. That's become a major concern of the U.S. Navy. That's why the sailplanes on U.S. Navy submarines, which used to be on the sail, have now been moved to the bow. The reason being that those sailplanes on the sail would be subject to damage, level damage, to try to break through the Arctic ice pack to reach the surface. And so therefore, they put them on the bow. They've now reinforced sails. They find it very easily, well, easy is always relative, to come to the surface through the ice pack. That's one of the reasons the Arctic is becoming, again, a scene of contention between the US and the Russians. Now, submarines use steam, so they went back to what's basically a standard, or has been for many generations, of surface ship technology, using steam turbines, which are still used in power plants all around the world today. Steam is, again, very power dense, relatively reliable, it's clean, it's relatively maintenance free. And one of the issues, though, is that they do generate a significant amount of radiated noise, which is one of the biggest drawbacks to it, since obviously stealth is what a submarine is all about, and having steam turbine whine or hum is important. If you saw my last lecture on the development of the naval attack submarine, you see the sound dampening technologies that were utilized today to make them mostly silent. That's basically an overhead view of a typical propulsion plant. I'm not going to give you any more details. There's the reactor, there's the engine room, and there's the propeller. That's about it. But only steam propulsion with a nuclear power plant can provide the amount of energy necessary to power the biggest class of submarines. This is a Ohio class ballistic missile submarine. It's over 20,000 tons, or close to 20,000 tons. It carries 24 ballistic missiles, has a huge crew. It's the largest submarine ever built in the US Navy. Russian submarines were even bigger. Okay. But not again. The advantage of nuclear power is great. It's silent, it can remain submerged. A lot of navies that operate submarines wanted something equivalent without going nuclear. So they're going to what's called AIP, or air independent propulsion. The reason is that an AIP submarine has almost no radiated noise. Again, a nuclear power plant has reactor coolant pumps, churning, which make sure that a lot of water is going through the reactor, that gives off noise. Steam turbines give off noise, and even though, again, there's great amounts of technology put into place to silence those, they still put off noise. However, electric submarine operating on batteries, an electric motor, is extremely silent. And so submarines now, non-US, are going towards other approaches. The first of the ever developed was the Walter turbine, which is World War II. Actually, it was in between the wars. A German professor was an air-independent submarine using a hydrol, which is H2O2. It achieved enormous, great speeds underwater against to what nuclear submarines could do. And the Germans actually developed a submarine class, the Type 23, which fortunately never went to sea, never engaged in combat, because again, it was a silent, high-speed submarine, independent of the air. A lot of navies today use a Stirling cycle. Those are developed primarily by Sweden for its Gotland and Submarine class submarines. Stirling engine also doesn't require submarine to surface, can remain submerged. The Australian Navy operates some of these submarines as well using the Stirling cycle. But the most recent version is using hydrogen fuel cells, which again is what a lot of people are looking for in terms of a green economy, green power source. Again, the submarine can carry all of its energy on board, doesn't need to surface. The German Type 212, which is on the bottom right-hand side, which is probably the most advanced non-nuclear submarine anywhere on the planet. Germans have been good at making submarines since long ago. Now, submarines use a variety of propeller and stern designs over the years. Many older submarines use twin screw propulsion. Over the years, though, it's become seen as inefficient, also requires gearboxes and couplings to make that work properly. So since the 1950s, most submarines today use a single screw approach, and you can see some typical submarine propeller designs along the way. Now, submarine design, propeller design has changed over years dramatically. What was normally a 4 or 5 bladed paddle propeller, you can see this on the upper left-hand side, that's a typical World War II submarine, which was a standard for 70 years. It started to be replaced in the 1970s with a multi-blade high skew design. This results in incredible advances in silencing submarines and making them quiet. One of the largest sources of radiated noise is cavitation. When a propeller blade is turning high speed, it's actually creating bubbles in the water. The bubbles, when they collapse, give off noise. If you've got a big submarine with a big propeller on it, it makes a lot of bubbles. Those bubbles make a lot of noise. When they collapse, they can be heard very easily. So this 1940s 4-bladed propeller was something that the Russians typically had on their submarines until they saw a photograph, and I believe it was in the New York Times, where for the first time, somebody took a photo of one of these multi-bladed high screw propellers. Not only didn't it have 4 or 5 blades, it had 9 blades. Some propellers today have 13 blades, almost like a turbine. The reason being that the skew design minimizes the creation of cavitation, so it can rotate at high speed, which is what you want, minimizing the propeller, but it doesn't have much thrust per blade. And so to get the thrust that you need to push that submarine through the water, you have to put multiple of these high skew blades into place, but it tremendously reduces the propeller cavitation. So when the photograph was published, and at the bottom right-hand side, that's the newspaper picture, it caused shockwaves through Washington, D.C., that this secret technology, which we kept secret, was now in the hands of the entire world to see. It caused alarm bells in Moscow, too, when they started saying, like, holy cow, what is that on the back of the submarine? U.S. Navy submarines had an enormous technology and silencing advantage over Russian submarines. We could find them without bother, while they found it very difficult to track our submarines. Reason being that, we used this radical new propeller design. So what happened? The Russians went out and bought Japanese CNC machines, and they developed, or they applied their brightest minds and engineers and computer scientists to mimicking or mocking up what the US did. So what happened? In the 1980s, the US government actually embargoed Toshiba, which was a Japanese machine tool maker, and said you can't sell machines in the US anymore. And they prevented them from selling these machines in the US for a few years as punishment for selling these advanced cutting technologies to the Russians, so they could actually shape these propeller blades that Russian machine tools could not duplicate. Now, though, again, nothing stays stationary. There's now what's called jet propulsor technology. You can see the pictures of variety. It's this housing, this shrouded housing, these ultra-quiet ducted pump jet propulsors. Again, the technology I'm not going to go into. I don't know about enough of it as well. These are, again, super secret in nature, but basically you think about it, it's like a turbine now at the back of a submarine. But again, there's specific concepts in terms of blades, designs, and the number of blade sections that put together to make that happen. Don't know enough about it other than say they're doing it, we're doing it as well. So since World War II, submarines have undergone a variety of missions, no longer attacking other submarines or surface ships. Now yes, they do that too, even today, attacking enemy surface ships and submarines.
But we also protect our aircraft carrier battle group. So when I was in the Mediterranean in 1986 with the USS Nimitz, I was on one of the guided missile escort ships. We had our escort with us, which was a 688 class Los Angeles class fast attack submarine tagging along. The Russians would, whenever there was a US Navy aircraft carrier, would send a bunch of their nuclear submarines to tag along us. In the event of war, they would immediately, try to disable the aircraft carrier. And so we had to compensate that. We brought our own submarine escorts to escort our surface ships, which were escorting the aircraft carrier to take out the Russian submarines. So, but they also do surveillance and reconnaissance. The Virginia class submarine, if you saw my lecture, has been built almost specifically for doing that kind of reconnaissance and surveillance and supporting SEAL team missions ashore. They lay mines, attack targets on land using cruise missiles, and they also can, again, correlate certain special force. And of course, ballistic missile submarines are a retaliatory nuclear strike force, not only for ourselves, but for other countries as well. So while most people think of submarines as submarines as submarines, in reality, there are multiple different types of submarines. These are only 7 different types. There are probably, if I remember thinking, it was like 14 different types of submarines. And you think, what? They do what? How can there be that many different? So the SSN is a fast attack, nuclear powered attack submarine. SSBN is a ballistic missile submarine, nuclear powered, and SS is a conventional submarine. And SSGN is a nuclear powered guided cruise missile submarine. And SSK is a hunter killer submarine. I'm not going to read through this all. They've gone through specialization. Although today the US Navy basically is we have a multi-role platform. The SSN basically does everything else that you can see on here. As it duplicates the role of the SSGN, and SSK, and SSA, and SSM. It does it all. So we now have ballistic missile submarines, SSBNs, and fast attack submarines, SSNs, which do multi-mission. So what do they do? Anti-submarine warfare using torpedoes, mines, and missiles. Anti-surface warfare the same way. We look at the anti-cruise missiles, land attack, cruise missiles, and strategic warfare, ballistic missiles. The last submarine combat was in 1982 during the Falklands War. That's when you're familiar with the famous sinking of the Argentinian cruiser Belgrano in May 1982. This is basically a month after the war began. It was the first time a nuclear-powered submarine had sunk anything. It was the first time any submarine had sunk anything since World War II also. Kind of a double mission, double success in that regard. But previously, there was a conventional submarine. The Indian Navy had sunk a Pakistani frigate during the 1971 Indo-Pakistani War. And also the last submarine lost in combat was in the Falklands War, when the Argentinian submarine Santa Fe, which was a German Type 201 submarine, was caught on the surface and attacked by British helicopters armed with missiles, which forced it to ground itself basically off an island down in the South Pacific. Now, the traditional submarine armament has been the torpedo. Now, traditionally, the torpedo term has to do with a moored explosive charge. So in 1864, or during the Battle of Mobile Bay, you've heard the familiar saying, down the torpedoes, full speed ahead by Admiral Farragut when he led his force into Mobile Bay. Torpedoes were that, exactly that. They were mines. And so the torpedo that we know of today was called an automobile torpedo or a mobile torpedo, which over time basically dropped the automobile or mobile section to become a torpedo. Now we have mines, we have torpedoes, but a torpedo is a self-propelled weapon system. So the ones that are used today are typically very powerful, long-range, and fast, heavyweight weapons. They're also the world's first self-guided weapon systems. You think about it, the technology, a torpedo was first developed in the 1870s with the first gimbals system for control and steering in the 1880s. 1880 technology, basically a self-regulating, self-steering system, was pretty phenomenal in that time. It was the very first self-guided weapon system. And they're powered by a lot of different technologies. Compressed oxygen, which is limited range. There's batteries, which also has limited range. And there's auto fuel, which is again a combustible fuel, which has its own oxygen supply, which makes it extremely dangerous to handle and use. But these are the ways that torpedoes are propelled. The old way of the torpedo destroying its target was to hit it. So you hit the side of the ship, blow it up. Today, however, torpedoes use magnetic sensor and now swim underneath their target and blow it up from beneath, causing it to break its back. I'll show the picture in just a second here. The types of torpedoes you see on the upper section, the first 3 are airdropped or surface ship torpedoes. The bottom one is a submarine torpedo, substantially bigger, as you can see, much longer in range as well. The Royal Navy Tigerfish torpedoes are also heavyweight torpedoes at the bottom, very similar to our Mark 48 torpedo. And this is the proximity fuse, as I mentioned before, that detonates the torpedo when it's beneath its target, causing it to break its back and then cause fatal loss of the ship. It's no longer something where it hits the side of the ship, you contain the flooding and you go back to port. There's no going back to port. Hit by a torpedo today, the ship is lost, you've broken its keel, the ship's going to go down. Now, while older torpedoes would swim down preset bearings, they couldn't change other than swimming down that particular bearing. Today's torpedoes allow themselves to react to the target that they're following. So the Mark 48 as an example can be either wire guided, so you've got somebody on a submarine that's actually controlling the torpedo towards its target using the submarine sonar system, or you can set it to attack autonomously. It goes through its own search pattern and then attacks the target on its own. So it's a fire and forget kind of system. Most torpedoes have multiple torpedo tubes, which can fire torpedoes and salvos. In World War II, submarines had both forward-firing torpedoes as well as rearward-firing torpedoes. Today's submarines with the nuclear power plant in the back is no rearward-firing torpedoes, although they also did away with the bow located torpedo tube. As you can see from this picture, the bow is now one gigantic sonar sensor. Okay, so it's made strictly for listening. So they moved the torpedo tubes aft to about a quarter of the way back from the bow. And therefore they fire at an angle to the side. The torpedo ends up going on the course it needs to go to attack its target. And you can see this is an awesome photo of a battle between two submarines. So submarines can also shoot a variety of cruise missiles. So they can target not only targets ashore, but also this is the primary weapon for long-range attack on surface ships. So if you're close enough to shoot a torpedo, they're going to do that with a Mark 48. But at the same time, if you're within the operating envelope of your Mark 48 of a surface ship, you're within the operating envelope of the surface ship's weapon systems to you. And so one way to get beyond that is to use an over the horizon targeting system. A submarine can hear a surface ship 50 miles away, 40 miles away without a problem, and it can fire a cruise missile, which will exit the water. It'll then descend to a very low altitude. It'll go over the horizon, blow up the ship, and all of a sudden the surface ship's like, where did that come from? That's really one of the greatest advantages of a submarine with cruise missiles. Now, submarine-launched cruise missiles have also speared the opening salvo of every major U.S. military conflict over the past 20 years. So the Tomahawk or Tomahawk land attack missile is extremely accurate. It carries a 1-ton warhead, also cluster munitions. So if you want to attack an airfield, when you break up a runway, it can do a whole bunch of different things. Different TLAM warheads do different kinds of things. They can destroy bunkers, in radar installations, fuel storage. Gulf War I started with the cruise missile attack. Gulf War II with the cruise missile attack. NATO Libya intervention, cruise missile attack. And the reason being, again, that they have very little reaction time. For a missile that breaks the surface, just offshore, streaks into land and hits a target, you don't have time to react, very little time to react. They also basically fly beneath the radar envelope for most search radars. So because of their stealthiness, today's modern submarines are considered game changers. In the event of war, they can attack countries, they can take out factories, government buildings, they can take out missile installations, radar stations, they can sink surface ships, they can sink out the submarines, they can do a whole bunch of things. And for that reason, the submarines are seen today as really the latest, as the most desirable technology. I remember reading that the growth in submarine acquisition is like 10% per year. I think that's crazy. That means that the Asian countries are building up, the Koreans are building submarines, the Japanese have been building submarines for a long time. The Singapore Navy operates submarines. Like Singapore, that's a little island state. They operate submarines. India is doubling the size of their submarine force. The Chinese Navy is tripling the size of their submarine force. South American countries, Chile, Peru, Argentina, Brazil, buying submarines. The United States has obviously been buying submarines. The European countries have been buying submarines. Submarines of all weapon systems, all naval weapon systems, I should say, are probably the most dynamic in terms of the number of countries that are actually investing tremendously in these technologies and building up their capabilities. The reason is, again, this is the weapon of choice. The submarine can do so much more than almost any other weapon system, attacking in the air, on land, underwater, on surface. And for that reason, companies see the value to them. Also know that they're, again, stealth weapon. That if you want to, carry out a surprise attack on one of your opponents, you can do so using a submarine. While other types of weapons, like aircraft, can be seen and spotted using radars in advance and alert your defenses to get ready. A submarine cruise missile attack coming in at 30 feet above the surface, you don't even see it until your Pentagon equivalent gets blown up by a cruise missile. So up until World War II, a lot of submarines carried deck guns as well. Basically, they ended in 1945. Not only is it a drag on the submarine, there's no place to put it on a nuclear submarine with this nice hydrodynamic hull. But in the interwar years, some countries got a little creative. The Royal Navy put a 12-inch battleship gun on a submarine. The French Navy had a twin-mounted 8-inch gun turret, basically a heavy cruiser style. But its vulnerability makes the submarine really, really big. It takes a long, long time when you're on the surface to submerge, because you got to take a lot of precautions and making sure that the gun is basically housed properly. And so guns went away, but mine laying has become very important. Not only was it really played a big role in World War I, and again, over 300 ships were sunk in World War I European waters by mine alone. Today, though, again, it's something that you can lay a minefield without the enemy knowing about it, and they can be command activated. So they're dormant on the bottom of the ocean or in a harbor entrance until there's a war happens, at which point you can command activate through a sonar signal, through sound, and these mines now become active. I can tell you that Taiwan, the seabed around Taiwan, is one gigantic minefield. The Straits of Taiwan, between Taiwan and mainland China, is one gigantic minefield. And the mines are sitting there, dormant, they're passive, they're safe right now. But if it came to a war, the Taiwanese would just need to drop a sonar buoy. It would give a certain acoustic signal. It would then activate all of those mines. And then any invasion force trying to invade landing tanks and troops by sea would basically be hazarding the force traveling through a gigantic minefield. So it have to be by air instead. And obviously, helicoptering in soldiers is vulnerable. Helicopters can be shot down easily with surface to air missiles. We've seen that in Ukraine with handheld shoulder-operated systems. You can draw paratroopers, but paratroopers can't carry heavy weapons. They can carry basically what they jump with. So it complicates the Chinese invasion plans tremendously. And a lot of these mines were laid by submarine. Because again, you don't know where they are. It's not like you have a surface ship going back and forth in a particular pattern laying mines. That can be observed. Chinese would just put a helicopter or ship, watch, and then plot that on their own map. Send a submarine out, putting a minefield in, no one knows it's there. No one knows it ever happened. So again, mine laying is still an important activity that controls strategic waterways like the Straits of Taiwan. In the Cold War, the Danish Straits were also one gigantic minefield to keep the Russian, the Soviet Baltic Red Banner fleet locked into the Baltic. They would never be able to get out into the North Sea or into the Atlantic Ocean, the Norwegian Sea. And mines all over it as well, though those have all been cleared away now too. So ballistic missile submarines now carry again. These are the planet killers. We talked about pigboats earlier on. Planet killers are these ballistic missiles that submarines carry. Anywhere from 12 to 24. Some of the older submarines, the first class of Russian ballistic missile submarine carried 3 in their sail. The reason being that these are tall missiles. They take up a lot of space. Therefore, you need a big submarine, or if you can't make a big submarine, you put the submarines in the sail to fire from. But again, today's U.S. Ohio-class submarine carried 24 missiles. Each missile, you think, okay, that's 24 targets, right? Each of those missiles carries multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles. 14. So multiply 24 times 14 times a megaton warhead, and you can basically wipe out continents at a time using one submarine, because they would have over 300 warheads on board. It's about to be 24 missiles. Each missile carries 14 warheads. They can attack their own separate target. It's incredible what's going on today. As you can see, the growth of the ballistic sub-missiles has gone up over time, from the A-1, the very first Polaris missile, to the D-5 Trident II missile on the right-hand side. The reason it has this nice round top to it, because there's 14 warheads in a ring around at the top. It's like, they call it the bus. As it flies over its target, one warhead gets off the bus, flies to its target, warhead keeps it flying, drops off another, or the nose cone gives off another missile or warhead, flies to its target. It's, again, really incredible technology. A lot of it developed in Draper here in Cambridge. So this is a picture of the missile bay on the left-hand side of the Ohio class, and the Russian Typhoon class is on the bottom right, which is even bigger than the Ohio class. This is a close to 30,000 ton submarine, which is just, that was basically what the Red October was. The Red October had a magnetohydraulic system for propulsion, which is basically magnetic in concept. Did they develop it? We tried, they tried. You could get it to work on a prototype basis, but you couldn't power a big submarine off of it. It was a silent system, no moving parts, just moving water using magnetism to push water through. So submarines over the last 100 years have also been carrying out different types of missions. As you can see, we carry commandos. The Japanese, the British, the US have been carrying commando forces to raid installations on enemy territory as well. In fact, if you didn't know, the very first hostile action of Japan against the US in World War II was a midget submarine attack on Pearl Harbor, not the aircraft. The submarines were already engaged when a US Navy destroyer had spotted a periscope. If you've seen the movie, which one is that? Tora Tora Tora, which is a pretty good movie. That's also like a quasi-documentary where a US destroyer attacks a periscope trying to enter the Pearl Harbor entrance, and radios that it's depth charging an enemy submarine. Of course, everybody's like, "What are you talking about? It's Sunday, What do you stop fooling around? It's not a joke." But that was the first, was a Japanese miniature submarine attack. Now, over the years, submarines have been carrying special shelters and containers to put on them to do different kinds of interesting things, carrying equipment or people or aircraft. So in the 1930s, the US and Britain tried aircraft, but determined that having a hangar on a submarine was harder than having a big gun on a submarine and not worth pursuing. However, the Japanese built a ginormous submarine class, the I-400 class, which was, again, one of the longest range submarines in the world. Over 20 years, they were the largest submarine on the planet, and they actually built and could carry float bombers, and they were designed for attacking the US installations in the Panama Canal. They could put out the Panama Canal locks. It means all the US ships from the East Coast would go all the way around Cape Horn to the Pacific, the long way, as opposed to cutting through. So they tried it. Interestingly enough, though, aviation is coming back to submarines through the use of AAVs, or UAVs, the unmanned aerial vehicles, or autonomous aerial vehicles. Now, these are smaller. They basically is handheld in size, but this is first generation. This is just we're just on the cutting edge of looking at drone technology on submarines. Drones, as you can see in Ukraine, are everywhere. They're attacking armed personnel carriers, destroying tanks, taking out artillery batteries, just doing astonishing things that 5 years ago nobody would have suspected. Drones have basically taken on a life of their own. So drone technology now is starting to be studied in terms of how it can be utilized. Now, the bottom picture is actually a drone deployment system that can be used when the submarine's still underwater. So basically, a tube comes up, opening happens, it has this rail system, folding wings, and you can launch a drone at sea from underwater with the submarine still submerged, fly to its target, send you targeting information, carry out a reconnaissance mission, all kinds of really cool stuff. It's still under development today. Who knows what they're doing? Now, one of the strange developments was the radar picket submarine. So if you remember, during the US invasion of Okinawa, Okinawa was only 90 miles off the Japanese coastline. And so the Japanese sent wave after wave after wave of air attacks against our troops invading Okinawa. So to be able to warn our troops and our landing craft and our amphibious vessels that the Japanese were coming, the US Navy stationed destroyers with radars between Okinawa and the Japanese mainland. The result was that they became the main target of Japanese aircraft. These 18-year-old neophyte Japanese pilots told to attack the enemy as they're flying to Okinawa to look down, hey, there's a target, I think I'll dive on it. Not realizing it's just one radar picket destroyer, that the real target that should be going after the amphibious ships full of troops and ammunition and everything else on the beaches. And so the destroyers of picket were taking enormous damage. I think we lost 20, either sunk or dead, severely damaged 20 destroyers. So the Navy looked for a solution. That was to, hey, we're going to put a radar on a submarine. When the aircraft start coming, we warn our people and we dive. Then they can't find us. Yeah, okay, conceptually that was an interesting idea. Maybe with propeller-driven airplane, but once a jet aircraft came along, you've got not minutes, but seconds of time to submerge. It's not going to happen. So they decided to develop as a dead-end concept. Remember my previous talk on the Navy attack submarine, the USS Triton, the largest attack submarine ever built in the US Navy, twin reactor, twin propeller, giant beast, was built as a radar picket submarine. It was huge. It was the biggest attack submarine ever built. Same thing with jet aircraft. No, you're just sitting down, even if you're a submarine, you can dive. So what do submarines use to detect and find their enemy? We're going to wrap up this here pretty shortly. It's basically sound, and they use sonar, which is an acronym for sound, navigation, and radar, and ranging. It's basically using sound both actively as well as passively. Active is the ping. You heard in the World War II movies, ping, ping, right? As they're sending pulses into the water, waiting to hear an echo coming back. Or passive sonar. Passive sonar is basically just listening, but you're listening for different frequencies on the sound spectrum. So one is a reflected wave, one is the original wave. This is the difference between passive and active sonar. I'm not going to go into great detail, but again, submarines can do both. They can go to listen, if it's outside, as well as they can actually search for using an active sonar. Now, how good is the technology? When the Soviets were developing their Akula class submarine, which was a liquid metal cooled super submarine, it could operate at 40 knots. It was an incredible piece of technology. They were testing it in the Norwegian Sea. And where did we first detect it? In a sonar station off of Bermuda. So that was 4,000 miles away. We could hear that Russian submarine operating in the Norwegian Sea because our technology was that good. Okay, we could hear things that were just unbelievable through passive sonar, just hearing what was radiated into the ocean by the submarine operating at 40 knots doing one of its speed races off of the Norwegian coastline. So I said before, passive sonar means exactly that. There's high frequency, which are turbine pumps, motors, generators, and stuff that is man-made. And there's low frequency, the propellers, flow noise around the hull, and so forth. And every US ship, every US anti-submarine aircraft has basically a data bank on board in a computer. They drop a sonar buoy, or they trail a sonar system behind it, and whatever they hear, they'll just query the sound signature, they'll plug it into the computer, and it'll say, not only is it this class of submarine, it's this exact submarine, which was a shock to me when I did a anti-submarine aerial mission with the German Navy, where we went to the Baltic Ocean, and we're dropping sonar buoys. I said, oh, that's the, I can't remember the name of the submarine. Like, wait, what? You know the exact submarine? Every submarine has its own signature. Every submarine's built slightly differently, gives out its own rated noise. And so they knew exactly what submarine was beneath them as they were flying over it, which was just shocking to me. This was 1980, so it was a long time ago. So older submarines carried their sonars on top of their bows. You can see this Foxtrot submarine, the Oberon, which is a British submarine, and then the Collins submarine, which is again Australian submarine. As you can see, it's gone from something you mount on the top to something located at the front to now the entire bow basically is the sonar. So in addition to the full bow dome sonar, there's also a variety of different flank sonars along the side of the submarine called conformal arrays. They have towed arrays as well, so you can listen to what's behind you. If you remember the movie Hunt for Red October with the Crazy Ivan, right, when the submarine would do a 90-degree turn to see if it was something behind it. Because all rated noise, you have your propeller noises behind you, so you can't really know if there's something back there. So you can do a 90-degree turn and see if you could hear any rated noise coming to the side, if you remember that, the Crazy Ivan. Well, nowadays, you can just tow a towed array behind you and it listens to what's coming out from behind. These are incredibly sophisticated. Surface ships carry them as well. Conformal arrays are along the side of the submarine, so you can hear incredibly sensitive. This technology now is phenomenal. It allows US submarines to detect enemy submarines at 3 times the range that their sonars can detect us. It's just phenomenal. It uses laser systems and fiber optics for the slightest, smallest sound variation, and make, again, our submarines the world winning. There's not an enemy submarine, unless it's a air-independent propulsion German Type 212 operating on battery or fuel cells, that can stand a chance against one of our submarines. So this is what a Type 212 submarine looks like. I just mentioned the German submarine. It's the most advanced non-nuclear submarine. And you say, okay, that looks simple enough. But in actuality, there's a whole bunch of sonar systems visible, okay? There's a mine detection sonar, and the upper looks up, because mines are, in many cases, are tethered mines. You're not really going to be able to find, bottom laid mines. Those are hard to see against the ocean bottom. They've got a cylindrical array in the front, passive and medium for both active and passive, searching for submarines. You got their own flank array. You've got ranging sonars on the side. Submarines are a lot like stealth aircraft, just packed with electronics that, if at a simple glance, wouldn't tell you anything unless you know what you're looking for. And you can see this is the Collins class Australian submarine Sterling engine, which is pretty cool. It carries its own conformal array. This allows them to target an enemy long distances. So normally, if you have a sound signal at some distance from you, you can tell the bearing. Okay, it's at 020 degrees, but you can't tell how far away it is. Right? It might be loud, it might be faint, but all you know is that if you have a single sensor, it says it's at 020. If you have this conformal array, now you basically turn your submarine at an angle. Now the sound wave hitting will hit the front bow, the front, the middle, and then the stern. The time signal lapse between those will tell you through a triangulation system. It's not only at 020, it's 16 nautical miles away from you, exactly. So all passively. So the old passive sonar only used to give you bearing, where it's coming from. Now, using passive technology, using a conformal, you can not only tell where it's coming from, how far away it is, which again it's incredible technology, and it takes amazing amounts of computing power for that microsecond lapse in time for the sound wave hitting the front, middle, and the back of the submarine in each of these three arrays to tell you what to do triangulation. So, in summary, I'm here to end. What time is it? Submarine is an incredible technology marvel, and again, one of the most formidable weapons of war ever developed. We're not going to talk about tactics. That's for a future presentation of how we use these submarines in combat, what submarine and anti-submarine warfare is all about. And with that, I'm at an end, and I'm open to questions. So thank you for your time and patience.
Can we just get some lights back? Is it easy enough to just turn on lights like this? Yeah, okay. Whoa, all right, everybody, get your pens out. We're going to give you a quiz.
So I apologize for going so quickly. This is again a 2-hour presentation that I had to do in an hour.
Okay,
How much time?
Bob, you want to get a mic? We're going to do some questions. We will happily entertain your questions. And you will go first. Susan, where are you?
Yes.
Can you take care of any questions that come in on Zoom?
Yes.
Okay. Sir, you are first. This is being recorded.
Oh, okay. How fast can a typical submarine today submerge?
Submerge or sail? I mean,
Submerge.
submerge.
Take the submerge.
A nuclear submarine doesn't need to secure its diesel engines, close the hatches, change to battery, which is the old submarines. In that case, it would take a World War II submarine up to 2 minutes to be completely underwater. A nuclear submarine today, you just put your bow planes down, and the submarine will dive as long as there's nobody up on the sail on the bridge. Getting the bridge people in under the into the pressurized compartment takes seconds, so it would take less than 30 seconds from above the surface to submerge, well, before taking minutes of time.
Bob, do you have anybody over there?
Just a comment about your discussion sub. I think you missed one little gap. Before the FBMs came along, they had the Regulus.
Yes.
And the Regulus, just ran as if what they had to do was a submarine maybe a few hundred miles out to sea would surface. They were carrying a missile on the deck. They crank it up and fire it. But the thing is, it wasn't as sophisticated as today, so you had between the target and the missile and the target, you probably had 2 or 3 submarines lined up with an antenna up that guided to its source.
Right.
Obviously, it never made it into, they used it, training and everything else. It was never in a war, but it was that just before
It was the gap or stopgap. So yes, the fleet ballistic missile submarine today is again, it's a fully ballistic, self-contained missile. The Regulus was an air-breathing missile which carried fuel. It carried in a hangar at the bow of the submarine. So it wasn't an airplane, but it had wings, and it took time to stage it, to set it up, to fill the fuel because they wouldn't keep it fueled in the bow compartment. You have to fill the fuel tanks, you have to download the programming. It was an interim gap between that allowed us to do some strategic attack on an enemy homeland, and it only had like a 2,000-mile range, which is again, it's not bad, but not 4,000 to 5,000 miles that a late model ballistic missile had. But it was an interesting stopgap.
And they were called submariners, not submariners.
That's right. Okay, sir, you're next.
Hello?
Yep.
Any World War II vets in the audience? Yeah. I was 11, December 7th, and my cousin was on the destroyer Ward, which was not sunk. He was the officer of the deck and using a .45 pistol to shoot a Japanese plane. He didn't like the ambiance, so he went to New London, and for the rest of the war, he was the exec on the Salmon.
Wow.
Do you have a log of U.S. submarines by name?
No, but you can find that. I mean, on Wikipedia they do.
I see.
Wikipedia has a complete list of every submarine built, and the also U.S. Naval Historical Center has a really great resource there as well for every submarine ever built, every ship in service ever in the U.S. Navy, going back to the Revolutionary War.
He and his 3 brothers were Naval Academy.
Good for him.
41.
I like it. Sometimes they say I was born 20 years too late, but anyway.
Okay, Marion?
I'm giving away my age, but the one submarine, the first submarine picture I ever saw was Run Silent, Run Deep. What kind of submarine was that?
That was a US Navy fleet boat. Now, there were several different classes of fleet boats, but they were very similar. They were over 300 feet long, they had 10,000 mile range. They had carried a 5-inch gun on their bow, and they were used originally they were supposed to escort the surface fleet. We came to realize that, what are we doing running around? If we have a submarine, they were high speed, built for surface running. But at nighttime, it's easy to get run over if you're operating with surface ships. So they said, we don't need to be escorting our aircraft carrier battle groups or carrier attack groups. We're going to send them on attack missions to go after the Japanese merchant marine and attack Japanese naval assets instead, which is what they did. But that was a fleet submarine, yes.
All right, I believe we have some questions from our Zoom audience. Susan?
Yeah, so we have a couple. How many classes of US subs are there?
I don't have the exact number. I've been going back to 1901, probably. In the 1920s and 1930s, they built multiple classes of like 4 or 5 submarines at a time. And so they had probably half a dozen just that time period, 1930s alone. In the 1940s, fleet boats were like 4 different classes. And then since that time, there's been, again, attack submarines, the SSNs, ballistic missile submarines, SSBNs, total probably a rough guess 30 types of classes.
Thank you. And then someone just asked, can you comment on unmanned subs?
Sure. So unmanned submarines is also becoming similar to the drones at sea, a big deal. The US Navy actually has, and it's not part of this presentation, a substantial unmanned submarine that can be used for unknown purposes. It's 100 feet long, so it's not a mini submarine. It's not a full-size submarine, but it's autonomous. It doesn't carry a crew on board. So this large unmanned submarine is currently undergoing testing in the ocean today. But the Navy is extremely sensitive, for understandable reasons, about what it does, why it's been built. And it can also carries an air-independent propulsion system, so it can travel underwater for sustainable time periods without surfacing. So whether it's a spy submarine, whether it's intended to be used as an autonomous vessel in support of submarines, no one really knows. They're being extremely tight-lipped about it.
No,
And then, wrap up. Do we have time for another question?
Go right ahead.
I don't exactly understand this question. I'm sure
Okay.
you will better than me. But conformal arrays and radar detection of signal phase, not only time of arrival, are used for detection. Wouldn't that be possible for submarines?
That's exactly the concept. That is the time of arrival of the sonar sound wave as it hits different arrays on the submarine hull. The timing between it, against microseconds, can tell you what can triangulate. And US surface ships have been doing that for some time now using radar. So they can passively target an enemy ship that's 300 miles away. And they know not only the bearing, where direction it is, but how far away it is, without using any active systems, simply by the time of arrival of this radar wave on a US Navy ship. So US surface ships also carry conformal arrays, as well as the submarines do, except they use radar, submarines use sonar for sound waves instead. But yes, exact same principle and concept.
Okay, and then last one, what's the difference of the number of Navy personnel on old submarines versus new ones?
So the World War II boats carried a crew around 80 men. Today's submarines carry a crew over 200.
And that's it from Zoom, thank you.
Okay. I just want to make a comment here. At our last month's program on the Squalus and the Sculpin, John Monahan, one of our loyal audience members, located an out-of-print book. I don't know if you remember that. And he gifted the book to our speaker, Bob Began, and it was all about submarines and so on. Well, John is at it again. John brought this copy of a handout, which most of you have, and I just wanted to thank him for it. Do you know how to read a submarine's battle flag? So, John, if you wanted to make any comment about this, how you found it, what inspired you to do it.
Well, I think it's
no,
kind of
hang
late.
on, I'm going to
Kind of
bring
late
you
in
the
the
mic.
day.
it's kind of late in the day, but I would only
No,
bring.
wait a minute.
Okay,
Hang on.
thank you. With the lateness of the time, and I think we're all kind of a little bit burnt out, what you have, for the most part, is the battle flag of the USS Bar. And of interest, if you look at the very bottom of the battle flag, you'll notice the locomotive is on there as opposed to a ship or anything else. And I let the moderator speak to what happened in that instance.
So, sure, so turn my thing off. So the crew actually sent ashore a demolition party, which set charges on a railway section which was close to the coastline. The idea was then to disrupt Japanese military logistics communications along the coast by blowing up, it was a tunnel, I believe, correct? And therefore, once the tunnel was collapsed, it'd be almost impossible to try to use that rail line for moving Japanese military hardware, goods, and men back and forth. So they were able to put a locomotive that was a successfully accomplished mission.
So that's a story of a submarine which sank a railroad train. Thank you, John. Okay, we have time for 1, 2, maybe final questions. Are there any more questions? If not, okay.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Thank you
Appreciate
so
your
much.
patience.
Now we know everything we always wanted to know about submarines.